Well, good morning. It's 8 o'clock, and we are really excited to see y'all here for our Central Region Tennessee Extension Master Gardener Conference. And as you can tell, we are trying something new today. And so this is very much our first real hybrid event. And so we're really looking forward to a fun morning together where we can drink our coffee and hear some great presentations, and then having the opportunity to be live outdoors this afternoon and see some of the great horticulture that is Warren County, Tennessee. So I'm actually in McMinnville right now. We even have some of the Warren County folks that are not too far away watching and packing goodie bags as we speak. Our first speaker of the day, which of course is one of our extension specialists who we always enjoy hearing from, Dr. Alan Windham, who's our extension plant pathologist. He works at Ellington Ag Center out of the Central Region Office and the Soil Plant and Pest Center in Middle Tennessee. And of course, he has a very practical research and extension background. Certainly one of the voices that we respect and always enjoy hearing from. He is going to be sharing some about the UT Dogwood story. And so you may not know this, but dogwoods are a huge crop for the nursery industry in Tennessee. I had to look this up for a grant a couple of years ago, and to the best of my knowledge, this is still a true statement. But as far as nursery production, there are as many and quite possibly more young dogwood trees here in the state of Tennessee than there are in all of the other 49 states put together. So it's a big crop for us, and UT has had a really interesting and very impactful role in the dogwood industry from research and breeding. And that is what our first presentation is going to be about. So Dr. Windham, we're so glad to have you this morning, and I'm going to turn the proverbial microphone over to you.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Thank you, Natalie. This is an interesting story, and I don't have time to tell you all the backstory of this presentation, but there's a lot of stories that go into the UT Dogwood story. If I knew someone that wrote nonfiction, this would be a very interesting little science book. So let's start. As Natalie said, dogwoods are huge in Tennessee. It's tens of millions of dollars that it brings into our nursery growers and retail garden centers every year. And they're just a wonderful plant. And a lot of people mistake the white bracts for petals. They're not. You can see that some photos that I took here of one of the dogwoods that I named Appalachian Joy, of the inflorescence and the small flowers, the little yellow petals. But it's just a beautiful plant. So basically, the UT story starts with the dogwood team. And why did we get people together to even form a dogwood team? Well, two words: dogwood and anthracnose. Things were going pretty well for the dogwood industry, going really well, as a matter of fact. Dogwood anthracnose was found simultaneously in the New York City area and the Puget Bay area of Seattle in the late 70s. And then it spread rapidly. As a matter of fact, you're probably familiar with chestnut blight. Chestnut blight moved at about 20 miles a year down the Appalachian Mountains. Dogwood anthracnose moved at about 100 miles a year. So just in a short period of time, you could find it in a lot of different places, especially East Tennessee, especially in the mountains of East Tennessee, Lookout Mountain, the Cumberland Plateau. It's fairly easy to find. And we were really concerned about what it meant for the nursery industry. And as Natalie said, dogwood production is unbelievable in Tennessee, in the nursery area of McMinnville, and especially in Franklin County around Winchester and Belvedere. That's where a lot of dogwoods are grown that are shipped all over the U.S. As a matter of fact, if you go online and look at mail order things like White Flower Farm, most of the dogwoods that you'll see on there are dogwoods that were grown in Tennessee. And Tennessee is famous for dogwoods. This is a partial list. It doesn't even include any of the UT dogwoods. This is pre-UT dogwoods. These are dogwoods that were discovered by nurserymen like Ike Hawker-Smith and Hubert Nicholson and Don Shadow, that were named. They were selected. You can imagine a nurseryman walking through their field year after year. They see a sport, they see something interesting, maybe something dwarf, something special, or just a walk in the woods, and they see something. And a lot of the photo there in the bottom right-hand corner is a dogwood called Sweetwater Red. It's an older dogwood. You don't see it too often in the trade anymore, but you do see it in botanical gardens and arboretums. But wow, if you think of all the dogwoods that have been released by Tennessee nurseries, it's just incredible. So let's look at the dogwood team. My brother Mark is a distinguished professor of plant pathology. He and Bob Trajano headed up the dogwood team. Bob was recently named a chancellor's professor at UT, first one ever on the ag campus. So that's quite an honor. And then myself, I did some work with Dogwood and Anthracnose in the evaluation of the Appalachian series of dogwoods. Other members that are no longer active, Will Whitty still lives in the Knoxville area. He's retired from, I put OHLD because it was Ornamental Horticulture and Landscape Design Department when he retired. Effin Graham was a horticulturist. He was did a lot of work with us. John Skinner was in our department, entomology, plant pathology. You know, dogwoods are notorious for not self-fertilizing. So when we were trying to make crosses on dogwoods, John helped us set up cages and use his bees to make crosses. Phil Wald was a postdoc in Bob Trajano's lab, and his release is one of the latest releases of the dogwood team, and more about that later. So let's start with chapter 1, Dogwood and Anthracnose. This is a story from the Washington Post, and this was years after Dogwood and Anthracnose was found, but it kind of sets the tone of what was going on in the forest. In the forest, dogwoods were dying, massive die-off because of this anthracnose disease. And the disease was exotic. It was introduced, and it just really wiped out a lot of dogwoods. This article quotes Bob Anderson, was a plant pathologist, U.S. Forest Service that we worked with early on. Lots of people were involved in the dogwood story. This was an illustration from the Washington Post, and it didn't quite get it right because, you know, it's talking about dogwood anthracnose, and dogwood anthracnose really, the symptoms usually are later in the season after bloom, so it doesn't really affect the bracts like it shows here, but it does show, you know, a tree that the sickly dogwood and the lesions on the leaves are correct, but it just shows that, you know, newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post were writing stories about a plant disease. Let me tell you, that is noteworthy. That doesn't happen too often. So Mark and I got involved. We were in the late 80s. We didn't really know if dogwood anthracnose was even in Tennessee, and we were looking in the Chilhowie Mountains of East Tennessee, Cherokee National Forest, for dogwood anthracnose. And someone called from the Lookout Mountain area and asked why the dogwoods were dying on Lookout Mountain. So of course we went there, and what we found was dogwood anthracnose was killing dogwoods, not only in the forest, from Point Park down to the river. If you followed trails, there were lots of dogwoods that were infected and dying, but also up in the park space on top of Lookout Mountain, you could find dogwoods that were infected with anthracnose. Just a little side here. There is a really common anthracnose disease of dogwood, spot anthracnose. This shows pretty severe symptoms, quite different from dogwood anthracnose. You can find a little bit of this scattered throughout the range of dogwoods, unlike dogwood anthracnose, but the little spots on the bracts, the white bracts, the little red spots on the leaves are characteristic of spot anthracnose, and this is not dogwood anthracnose. If you see this, generally it's not a big deal. It can affect bloom, but not a big deal. So one of the people we met early on when we were discussing dogwoods was Keith Langdon, a park ranger and biologist at Catoctin Mountain Park in Maryland. This is the mountain park that also includes Camp David. And Keith said, you know what, dogwood anthracnose has really just wiped out our dogwoods, and this might be a good place to look for survivors that might be resistant. So Mark and Effin Graham and I think Will Whitty went up, and they went through the park, and they found 4 dogwoods, and they took cuttings, brought them back. So what they found, what this is kind of what the Lookout Mountain and Catoctin Mountain part looked like. Dogwoods were being infected. They were dying. Why were they dying? Because when the foliage was killed, the dogwoods would produce little shoots on the trunk, and then the disease would kill those down to the trunk. And at the base of those little shoots, you'd have a little canker. You've got enough of the cankers, the trees would die. So Catoctin Mountain Park definitely was affected. So they found 4 trees. They took cuttings. They propagated those. Will was really helpful with the propagation. And then with the help of Bob Anderson, who I mentioned earlier in the U.S. Forest Service, they tested the dogwoods for Catoctin for resistance to dogwood anthracnose. And of the 4, one of them really stood out as being resistant. And that dogwood was named Appalachian Spring. And it was immediately, it was released within a few years to the nursery industry. It's still grown. It's probably the most popular of the Appalachian series of dogwoods grown by nurseries. If you do an internet search, you can find a lot of information about it. There's some characteristics that the nurserymen really like. Number one, as these are budded, these are Appalachian Spring dogwoods budded onto a plain white seedling rootstock. And the nurserymen love this as a seedling because it's so vigorous. It has huge leaves, almost the size of your hand. And it's probably still the top seller of all the dogwoods that we've released. Like I said, the juvenile leaves on young trees and in the nursery, they are just huge on Appalachian Spring. So of course, to preserve it, we planted some Appalachian Spring at the UT Arboretum at Oak Ridge. One of the characteristics about Appalachian Spring is that it's got pretty long, kind of floppy white bracts. This is not necessarily something that nurserymen love. They often love the smaller, stiff bracts on a dogwood, but the main seller of this was resistance. So one of the areas of the country this has been a big seller has been the Northeast, where dogwood anthracnose continues to be a problem. So from all the research, Mark and Bob, Effin, Will Whitty, Johnny Knighton with the Forest Service released this, or they wrote this paper for Hort Science in 1998. And it was a description and kind of the Appalachian Spring story, kind of telling the world about this first of the anthracnose resistant dogwoods. So as I said, it's fairly popular. This is a pot nursery in the McMinnville area that grows dogwoods. These, I was there a couple of years ago. These were all Appalachian Spring dogwoods that they were growing. So it's been adopted by a lot of nurserymen in a lot of states. I've been to Turtle Creek Nursery north of Charlotte, North Carolina, where they were growing a lot of the Appalachian dogwoods. So it's definitely getting around. And as a matter of fact, this would probably be, if you walk into a botanical garden or arboretum, New York City, anywhere, and saw one of our dogwoods, this probably would be the dogwood you would see. And it does fairly well. This is one in front of my wife and I moved from Murfreesboro, where we had lived for 30 years. 4.5 years ago, we bought a townhome, and I bought a Appalachian Spring at a local nursery, planted it, and it's done really well. It's been a really good tree. And as you can see, it's got the big white bracts, a little bit floppy, but it's still a very nice tree. And has decent fall color. This is a photo I took of Appalachian Spring at Cheekwood fall 2018. I will tell you this, fall color on a dogwood is variable. And some years they look terrific. Some years they don't, just like any other tree. So be careful about buying a dogwood just for fall color, because it may not look like this every year. So resistance, Appalachian Spring has, although we don't advertise it or talk about it too often, Appalachian Spring on the right there does have some resistance to powdery mildew, which I'll talk more about in a minute. But this is from my tree that I showed you that was in bloom in front of the townhome. I took a cuttings of it, cuttings of a white seedling nearby that were susceptible to powdery mildew. So this is, for disease management, resistance is just the way to go. And it's well worth it if you can find plants for your garden that are resistant to common diseases. Appalachian Spring has gotten some accolades. The Garden Club of America. It wasn't Plant of the Year of 2006, but it did receive an honorable mention. I think Kentucky, it was beat out by Kentucky Coffee Tree that year, which is interesting. But anyway, it has gotten recognition over the years, and a lot of people know about it. The Appalachian Dogwoods, where can you buy them? You're not going to find them in a big box store. You're going to find them in an independent garden center or online. This is a screen grab from White Flower Farm this season, and as you can see, they were sold out very quickly. And this happens if you think you might want to buy a dogwood from, reputable mail order business. Be quick about it because they do sell out very quick. The other advice I'd give you when you're buying a dogwood is I probably would buy it in the spring when it's in bloom. And that way, number one, you've got an idea that you're getting the right dogwood, that it's a white, not a pink. But that if it's blooming well, it will continue to bloom well. And if it doesn't have many flowers on it, it may not. So if you're buying just a white seedling, there are no flowers on it in the spring, I probably would not buy it. So you do pay a little bit more for a named dogwood, but in the end, it's well worth it. In 2021, Mark and Bob were invited back to Catoctin Mountain Park to give a kind of a symposium on the dogwood story. This is Mark planting an Appalachian Spring dogwood at the Catoctin Mountain Park Visitor Center in November of 2021. I haven't actually been back. That's not, you know what? That wasn't 2021. I think that was 2011, November 2011. Yeah, this would be time travel if it was 2021. So that's not correct. It was 2011 when Mark went back and planted this tree, and he and Bob gave the symposium. So kind of, full circle to go back to Catoctin and plant the tree. Well, let's move on to chapter 2. So that's kind of the dogwood anthracnose story. We were looking for short-term and long-term solutions. The short-term were fungicide trials that we had in nurseries looking for products that would control dogwood anthracnose. And we found what we found was that most any fungicide that was labeled for leaf spots did a pretty good job controlling dogwood anthracnose. Long-term, it was actually looking for resistance, and that's how Appalachian Spring came about. But let's look at powdery mildew, which actually turned out to be the bigger disease problem on dogwoods. So I had looked at a lot of dogwoods, diagnosing dogwood anthracnose since I started in 1985 with the university. Mark did also. Bob was actually here, I think, in 84. So he'd been here for some time. But in 1993, he got a dogwood specimen. I opened the bag here in the lab, looked at it. I was like, wow, powdery mildew. I had looked at a lot of dogwoods by now, mostly for dogwood anthracnose, but I had never seen powdery mildew. And it was a specimen from Cumberland County. By the mid-90s, it was widespread in the eastern U.S. Did it originate here? Probably not. Where did it originate? Possibly, when dogwood anthracnose was really big, there's more interest in Coosa dogwood. So more and more Coosa dogwoods, different types were being brought into the country. It's resistant to powdery mildew, but not immune. So it's possible that this mildew jumped from Coosa dogwood that was brought into the country to flowering dogwood. So the search began for resistance. Again, short-term, long-term solutions. Short-term, we were looking at fungicides for controlling it in nurseries and landscapes. Just about anything that was labeled for powdery mildew worked pretty well on this. Long-term, we were looking for resistant trees. Powdery mildew did increase production costs in nurseries by about $750 an acre. So it was, some people just quit growing. Some nurseries quit growing dogwoods because of the increased cost. But I will say this, those that did stick in and were all of a sudden they were spraying their dogwoods for powdery mildew, dogwood anthracnose just about disappeared from the nursery industry. So this is a little test I did. Some of the short-term solutions, again, we were looking for fungicides. I was looking at this test, looking at some organic products. This was copper octanoate. Also looked at neem oil. These trees were the same size when the test started. The one on the left was, these were just white seedlings. The one on the left was not treated for powdery mildew. You can tell it's covered up. I didn't have to inoculate. It was so, this test was done in 2007, 14 years ago. By this time, and continues every year, powdery mildew is pretty widespread. So you don't have to inoculate. You can depend on, if you put a susceptible dogwood out, it's probably going to show up. But look at the difference. Not only is the plant on the right, where I sprayed it with a copper soap fungicide, clean and free of the disease, but it's double in size. Stem caliber is greatly increased. So yeah, you know, powdery mildew is more than just an aesthetic problem. It does slow down the growth of dogwoods. Dogwoods infected with powdery mildew are going to set fewer flower buds. Stem caliber is going to be smaller, so it definitely affects the trees. So as I said, long-term resistance was viewed as the way to deal with this issue as we had with dogwood anthracnose. So Mark and his team started just going to nurseries and walking fields and flagging those trees that didn't seem to have. Most of the trees in a field like this were infected with mildew. But as he walked white seedling trees, fields of white seedling trees, he found that there were some that weren't affected. So he flagged those and they went back, dug those. I think they found 40 trees. And there's more in this next slide. So 40 dogwood seedlings were selected out of, you know, fields of over 1 million seedlings that they looked at. Trees were trialed in multiple locations and evaluated not only for resistance, but horticultural characteristics. There were focus groups asked to view the dogwoods. Which ones do you like? What do you like best? And 4 trees were chosen to release to Tennessee nurseries. So the way that goes is we always released our new trees to the Tennessee nursery industry first and gave them a year or two head start before they were released to nurseries out of state. Now there are nurseries all over the US that are growing some of our dogwoods. So resistance is a huge deal. This is Appalachian Joy on the right. This is one of the dogwoods that I named. This was named for my wife, Joy, and it's really nice tree. And you can see nice clean foliage here. This was October 2008, you know, when the leaves have been there all season. They're kind of beaten up, but still, this was at the UT Arboretum in Oak Ridge. One of the dogwoods that they have there, Little Princess, was covered with mildew. The Appalachian Joy was not. So these are the 4 dogwoods that were released to the nursery industry. And these were named after Mark's wife, Karen, Will Whitty's wife, Jean, and Bob Trajano's wife, Kay. And Appalachian Joy was named after my wife, Joy. And these are the photo at the bottom shows you the kind of the variation in the morphology of the bracts of all the different dogwoods. Appalachian Joy is actually on the left, and it has, one of the things that makes it a little bit unique, a little different, is that it generally has more than 4 bracts. It can have 4 bracts, but it can have up to 9 bracts, whereas the others are basically your 4-bract dogwoods. So these trees, again, have gotten there have been articles about these trees. There was an article in the Washington Post, a positive article about, hey, dogwoods are back. And it talked about Mark was interviewed. They talked about the Appalachian series of dogwoods released by UT. So I've got a friend at Cornell that told Mark and I that the New York Botanical Garden was planning another garden, and they were using the Appalachian dogwood. So this happened, I don't know, a month, 6 weeks ago. So when she told me that, I was like, well, I'll get online and see if I can find anything. And actually what I found was this article in the June issue of Fine Gardening called What a Good Dogwood. And written by Paul Capiello, who's the director of Udell Gardens near Louisville, Kentucky, who also wrote the latest monograph on dogwoods. And he also has quotes in this article from Mike Durr. So let's look at this article. So, I found this by accident. I'm reading the article online, and the first text goes, "Plenty of flowering dogwoods are great, but Appalachian Joy is one of the best." So, wow, that was a that was a nice moment to see Paul and Mike say this. And then he had a quote from Mike Durr in the article, where Mike is quoted talking about Appalachian Joy. "I've planted numerous Cornish Florida seedlings and watched most die," he says, "leaf spot, canker, boar's drought, etc. Too often win the day. I tested the Appalachian series and added Appalachian to the joy to our garden, consistently outstanding." And I will tell you this, and anybody that selects, breeds, releases new plants to the nursery industry, you have no idea if it'll ever see the light of day, if there'll be any interest at all, if it will ever. And I tell you, these dogwoods have really been exciting, because it's just about any botanical garden that you walk in now, if you look at dogwoods, you'll find them, and most of them I find by accident. I was at the North Carolina Arboretum a couple of years ago, and I walked into the stream garden. Joy and I were visiting, and there were 4 Appalachian Joys planted on the 4 corners of the stream garden. That's really neat to see that, a plant that you work so hard on actually be used in the landscape nursery industry. Okay, so where are we at now? Let's, there've been a lot of other projects that we've worked on since the Dogwood project, and the Dogwood project still continues. One of the things is that when powdery mildew hit, it was especially damaging to flowering dogwoods in the deep south. I would say south of I-20. If you go south of I-20, powdery mildew has added one more stress to already stressed dogwoods, and has killed a lot of dogwood. So one of the things that we've done is work with nurseries, commercial nurseries in the deep south. And this is Bracey's Nursery in Amite, Louisiana. This is Dr. Alan Owens, one of our collaborators. He's retired from LSU and works with Bracey's. And in the last 2 years, they have evaluated the Appalachian series of dogwoods to see how well they would grow in the deep south. And the dogwoods you see that him standing by are some of the Appalachian series. Now, what they found out was Appalachian Spring really didn't tolerate the heat in the deep south that well, but the other 4, Appalachian Mist, Snow, Joy, and Blush, did great. So they're really encouraged that they're probably going to be able to sell these to garden centers, landscapers, south of that I-20 corridor to try to get dogwoods growing even better than ever. One of the things, so far, I've only shown you white dogwoods with white bracts in the Appalachian series. But one of the people I mentioned as part of the dogwood team is Phil Wald, who was a postdoc with Bob Trajano. And Phil now is a geneticist with the USDA Ag Research Service in Charleston, South Carolina, where he's actually worked breeding vegetables. So, but this is our newest entry of the Appalachian series. This is Erica's Appalachian Sunrise, or Appalachian Sunrise for short. It's the first pink dogwood that the team has released. It's resistant to powdery mildew. This was actually a cross with Cherokee Brave and one of our white dogwoods. And it's pretty popular already. I was corresponding with Paul Capiello at Udell Nurseries after I read his article and thanked him for the nice article. And he said that, and I told him about this new tree. He goes, "Oh, we had it in our plant sale this spring and it sold out." Also, White Flower Farm had this for sale on their webpage this spring and it sold out. So this has only been released like a couple of years. So, it takes a while to build the numbers where it's more, where you can find it in garden centers. But again, if you found this in a garden center, it'd probably be an independent garden center that's known for, having other dogwood cultivars, or you'll find it online. What else have we released? Not as much publicity, and I actually don't know how much these are produced in nurseries, but Bob selected these two Coosa dogwoods. It's more interesting to see, these are Coosa dogwoods, but interest on dogwoods for small gardens. So this is Cornus Coosa Empire and Cornus Coosa Red Steeple that are more upright and they spread. So you might see these in years to come in garden centers, especially if you need something, don't have much space. This might be a Coosa dogwood for you. There have been other dogwoods released. He's released one, Cornus Coosa, I'm not sure, I think the name is Fusion, where the bracts are all fused and it actually looks like a little white square. And a lot of people look at that and they're like, that's a little too weird. I don't think I'd be interested in that. But the funny thing is, a nurseryman in Japan saw that. He was very excited about the unusual shapes of the bracts. So that particular Coosa is grown in Japan now by a nursery there. And some of the outcomes or outputs of the Dogwood team were this extension publication, Dogwoods for American Gardens, publication 1670. It's hard to find hard copies of these, but it's online. If you go to UT Extension and click on publications, you just type in Dogwoods. It's got a lot of good information about dogwoods, some of the cultivars, but yeah, it's one of the outputs of the Dogwood team. It still holds up pretty well. If you haven't seen this book, this is Paul Capiello, who wrote the article for Fine Gardening on dogwoods this month. He and Don Shadow released this monograph of dogwoods. It's really good. It covers all the different dogwood species, from Cornus Florida to Coosa to giant dogwood, Cornus controversa, to bunchberry, just any dogwood. The photography is great. It's well illustrated. This would be a great book for your library or for a coffee table. I love this book and I look at it a lot. So in the years since dogwood anthracnose first became an issue, what else have we worked on? Well, there have been other projects that mostly I've worked with Mark on these, or Mark's worked independently on these, but we've done hydrangea evaluations for disease resistance and cold hardness. Mark does a lot of his work at the Plateau Research and Education Center in Cumberland County. He's also partnered with Plant Development Services Incorporated out of the Mobile area. They grow a lot. They actually were the business that introduced the Encore azaleas. And one of the things Mark talked to them about was, how cold hardy were they? So he did a lot of cold hardy evaluations of the Encore azaleas at the research center in Cumberland County, as well as crepe myrtle and other evaluations for PDSI. Then thousand canker disease of black walnut became an issue on black walnut. We did some work on that. And then probably 10, 12 years ago, we were really big in looking at evaluating roses for resistance to black spot, Cercospora leaf spot, and powdery mildew. Those were interesting trials that we did not only in Tennessee, but we had plots down at the Southern Hort Research Lab at Poplarville, Mississippi, working with some collaborators down there to see which roses developed these diseases or were resistant in the Deep South. Interesting enough, some of our best roses in this leaf spot resistant trial were knockout rose, double knockout rose, pink knockout rose. This was all pre-rose rosette. After about 10 years of that project, guess what? Rose rosette became a huge problem. And since then, most of our research efforts have been on rose rosette, looking for resistance. There's a large team doing this, headed by Dr. Dave Byrne out of Texas A&M. We do a lot of the more practical evaluations where we have large plantings up at the Plateau Research Center that I mentioned. We've had students looking at the little mite that spreads the rose rosette virus. That's been really interesting. We have submitted a grant proposal. Hopefully we will be funded so we can continue this research. I will tell you this, I don't have a rose to tell you that's resistant to rose rosette, but the rose breeders keep looking at those that seem to have some resistance, making crosses, and we evaluate those. So that's it. I got one thing I meant to bring in here. So stay where you are just a second. I'll be right back. You know, I had one thing to do this morning, or two things, and I forgot number two. But anyway, I went out yesterday and I collected dogwoods here at the center. This is, I think you can tell these leaves are rolled and strap shaped. This is a white seedling that's infected with powdery mildew. This is Appalachian Joy from the Dogwood collection here. Look how nice and lustrous green that foliage is. No powdery mildew. And the white seedling is just covered with mildew. You may not be able to see it, but you can see these little rolled leaves that are strap shaped. So it continues to be a great plant. And again, boy, resistance is the way to go if you can find it. So any questions?
Yeah, we've got one to start you off with. Can you recommend a dwarf or smaller cultivar of dogwood?
So I don't know of one that's resistant to powdery mildew, but there's one called Pygmy. I think it was a Don Shadow introduction that's fairly small. There's one called Little Princess. So, you know, it's similar to Cherokee Princess, but just smaller. So if you want something that's small or dwarf, that's probably what I'd go for. Either Pygmy or, and I think Cheekwood has Pygmy in their collection if you want to go look at it when it's in bloom. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention was that Joy and I went up to Windham Forest this spring to look at their dogwood collection, because a lot of the photography in Paul Cappiello's dogwood monograph came from Windham Forest just south of Louisville. If you have never been there when the dogwoods are in bloom, it is fantastic, and I would definitely recommend that as a road trip.
Dr. Windham, Mr. Greg Upchurch, I've got two questions.
Go ahead, Greg.
Natalie, I'll put them in the chat.
Greg's getting a little feedback. Greg is actually here watching with some of our Warren County folks, and so we have multiple computers in the same room, so he's going to put them in the chat. One that
go ahead, Natalie.
Oh yeah, go ahead. You've got it.
Stephanie asked, what's a good product to use on trees and plants to avoid disease before infected? So there are a lot of good fungicides. Let's start off with organic products. The copper soap, copper octanoate, is very easy to find. It works pretty well on leaf spots and powdery mildew. Probably the only downside is you're going to be spraying about once a week when those diseases are active. Neem oil works actually pretty well on powdery mildew. Again, you're going to be spraying about once a week. So what about other fungicides? Immunox, easy to find, works well on leaf spots and powdery mildews. Propiconazole in a lot of different brand names like Infuse and others. It works well. So someone asked, is there any phytotoxicity with neem? When the test where I used it, the test where I showed you the two dogwoods that were sprayed and unsprayed, I was spraying it weekly. I did not see any phytotoxicity on dogwood. Now they were growing under shade cloth, so a little bit protected, but haven't noticed that to be a problem.
So you wouldn't anticipate anything different than the caution we would normally take with environmental conditions and any oil spray.
Right. I haven't noticed any.
One thing that I was thinking as you were talking, Dr. Windham, is we have folks on the call all the way from, the mountains of Greene County into West Tennessee. When you think about the distribution of anthracnose and powdery mildew, are there some geographical or elevation distinctions that come out for infection areas?
There really is. When we first found dogwood anthracnose, we didn't really know how it was spread, but it never really was a problem in the Nashville area. I had Mike Holt, who worked for Vanderbilt as a horticulturist for a while, brought in a sample one day he had noticed it in just a residential garden near Vanderbilt. It was dogwood anthracnose. And then either last year or the year before, someone from Brentwood brought in dogwood anthracnose. And occasionally we'll have people that will go visit relatives in Indiana, somewhere cooler climate, and collect it and send it to us to look at, and it'll be dogwood anthracnose. But West Tennessee, have never seen a sample of dogwood anthracnose from West Tennessee. Very rare in Middle Tennessee. And, you start to find it on the plateau, Lookout Mountain, in the mountains. So that's actually a good thing. So powdery mildew actually is probably the more damaging of the two diseases.
And it's almost like we planned this. That actually leads into Greg's question, which he got in the chat box, which is really, why is it that powdery mildew is so devastating for us in dogwoods in our region?
Well, powdery mildews don't have to have a lot of rainfall to be a problem. They just need high humidity. And guess what? We have lots of days of high humidity in the summer. So that's all it needs for the spores to germinate. And the spores whereas dogwood anthracnose spores were kind of formed in these fruiting bodies, and they're really sticky, and they may be rain splashed. Powdery mildew spores can be blown long distances. All they have to do is land on a susceptible dogwood leaf, and a colony starts growing. So we definitely have the conditions for powdery mildew in a lot of different plants.
Hey, Alan, this is Tom Stebbins. I was wondering, what's your theory on how those diseases evolve? We didn't see dogwood anthracnose. I think Trajano figured out it was from Asia or China or someplace. We always blame China, that sort of thing. But what about powdery mildew? Has there any been genetic tracing where that came from, or is it global?
Over the years, we've had Mark and Bob have had lots of students that worked on various aspects of dogwood anthracnose and powdery mildew. I think they don't really know the source of powdery mildew, but one of the things your students have found out over the years is that genetically, all the powdery mildews they've collected from many different states are all very similar. And when you find that usually means that it hasn't been here very long. And if it hasn't been here very long, that means it was probably introduced.
So when it comes then to the anthracnose resistant cultivars, are you finding that those are being sold, more readily outside of Tennessee to get into some of those, more northeastern or higher elevation areas where that's really a risk?
Yeah, I think, if you go to the Northeast, probably Appalachian Spring, because of its resistance to anthracnose, is the most popular. It is still sold. You'll find it on, online offerings like White Flower Farm and others. I'm trying to think who Wayside Gardens used to always have Appalachian Spring, and they sell a lot to the Northeast. But like I said, if you find one of the new dogwoods on a web page, first make sure I might check the reviews for the business to make sure it is reputable. But most of the names that you recognize, like Wayside, White Flower Farm, they sell out very quickly. But I've walked into Garden centers here in the Nashville area and also in Putnam County. And they have very nice selection of the Appalachian series of dogwoods. So it's just a matter of looking. The other thing I would say, if you have an independent garden center and they're not carried, don't ask them to carry them. They probably are not because no one's asked or there hasn't been a demand. All right, I've got a question from Melody Rose on email me. It's about including the Appalachian series at the newly named Northeast Tennessee Research and Extension Center. Would it be a good plant for that area? Actually, absolutely, would be a great plant. So, like I said, this whole dogwood story would make a pretty good nonfiction book because there were lots. I'll tell you one story. Mark was called into the UT system president's office, and I won't say who it was, but the president said, "Okay, Mark, how much money do you need to solve this problem, to eliminate dogwood anthracnose?" And Mark was like, "Well," he's like, "I'm not really sure because you're asking me to eliminate a disease. And if you think of all the millions of dollars that have been spent on diseases of humans, how many have we actually eliminated?" Well, the president didn't like that answer. And there was also a geneticist that was at the meeting, and he was like, "Oh, I can solve this problem in 5 years." Well, 5 years later, he did not solve the problem, and he left the university and went somewhere else. I'm not sure what he's doing now. But problems like this, you just keep grinding, keep working, and sometimes good things happen. And with the UT Dogwood story, it's been a great story.
Yeah, I think that kind of tells the story of breeding in the woody plant world. It's a long-term process, and you guys are what, 25 years or so into this story.
Yes. The other interesting thing was, as an extension person, you're not always warmly received when you're talking about a new problem that affects the #1 nursery crop of the state. There was a lot of pushback about, is dogwood anthracnose really a problem? Is it really a disease, or is it just air pollution or acid rain? And so, people are skeptical at first, and that's a good thing, actually. But in the end, a lot of the nurseries became our biggest supporters because not only did we help solve a problem, but we gave them a new product to sell that other nurseries in other states didn't have. So if you want to know how Mark became a distinguished professor, it was from letters from nurseries after several years in, and he was like, "Hey, these guys have really helped our industry." So that's very gratifying. I'll tell you one last story. I had someone from the Department of Ag called me one day and said, "Hey, a nurseryman wrote a letter to the governor about you." I'm like, "Oh, great." I'm like, "No, it's not good. They want you fired." But it was due to dogwood anthracnose. And this was early on. And luckily, the governor's office didn't know what to do with the letter, so they just passed it on to somebody else. So anyway, I tell people now, if someone's not writing a letter asking you to be fired, you're not doing your job, because you're going to have people that are supporters, people that are not. But in the end, I think even this guy changed his mind and decided we were okay, or I was okay. Luke is home. I'm glad you didn't get fired.
Yeah, we're all glad that the governor doesn't take all of his mail too seriously.
Right. Thank you, Lucas. Appreciate that.
I was just getting ready to kind of really tie that up into a neat bow and talk about how this is a great example of research and industry collaborations, and then Alan told the story about that. But we're really glad to have Dr. Windham in Tennessee, and we're so glad that he had the opportunity to share some of these connections with you. In fact, our next presentation is actually going to weave in some of these same industry and research collaborations. So if you have any more questions, pop them in the chat box. But if not, I'm going to say thank you very much, Dr. Windham, for joining us this morning.